The morning they delivered the deed to my daughter's place, it was a Tuesday in late October of 2019, and the fog was sitting so low on the bottoms that you couldn't see the fence posts from the road. I remember that detail because I had driven out before first light to meet the county recorder's vehicle, which was a white Silverado with a cracked windshield and a county seal sticker that had mostly peeled off one corner, and the man who handed her the envelope didn't say much of anything except that the transfer was recorded and she had 30 days to establish intent to use. That was the language. Intent to use. As if 40 acres of standing water and reed canary grass and silted over tile outlets represented some ambiguous situation that required a person to declare themselves. My daughter signed the acknowledgement form on the hood of that truck in the fog, and the man drove back down the gravel, and she stood there holding the envelope and looked at me, and I said, "Well, you own it now." She said she knew that. The county had sold it to her for $40 even, $1 an acre, 40 acres of the most ridiculed ground in the township, and she had paid for it with 2 20s she had folded in the front pocket of her canvas coat since September, waiting for the paperwork to clear. I want to tell you about what happened on that ground over the next 3 years, because it is a story about patience and about pigs, and about a notebook my father left in a wooden crate in the back of a machine shed that I didn't open for 11 years after he died. And if you stay with me, I think you'll understand why I tell it slow. My father used to say that the difference between a problem and a lesson is only whether you were paying attention. I did not fully understand what he meant by that until the spring of 2021, when 34 Berkshire Cross sows did something in 4 months of managed rooting that no dragline, no tile contractor, and no county drainage assessment had managed to accomplish in 60 years of trying. But I am getting ahead of myself, and this story does not reward being rushed. Let me back up to the beginning, or at least to the beginning that matters, which is September of 2019, and a county surplus land auction held in the basement of the township hall on a Wednesday evening when the corn was still standing, and nobody had much time to be sitting in folding chairs, looking at a plat map of problem ground. There were 11 people in that room. 7 of them were there for the other parcels, 2 small road right-of-way remnants, and a triangle of timber ground near the creek that someone's cousin had been meaning to buy for years. The remaining 4 people were there for various reasons having nothing to do with actually bidding on anything, which is a thing that happens at rural auctions more than outsiders would guess. My daughter was the only person in that room who raised her hand when the 40-acre parcel in the East Bottoms came up. The auctioneer read the legal description and the minimum bid and looked up, and she raised her hand, and he said, "Sold," and wrote her name in his ledger, and that was the whole auction. 40 seconds, maybe. A man sitting 2 rows back leaned over to the fellow next to him and said something that I will not repeat exactly, but the general meaning of it was that she had paid $1 an acre for standing water and would spend the rest of her life paying taxes on a cattail marsh. The fellow next to him nodded. I heard it. My daughter heard it. She folded her copy of the bid confirmation and put it in her coat pocket, and we walked out into the cool September evening, and she asked me if I thought she had done something foolish, and I told her I thought she had done something her grandfather would have recognized. She thought about that for a moment, and then she said, "Is that a yes or a no?" I said I honestly wasn't certain yet, but that I believed there was something in that ground that the county had not been able to see, and that if she could be patient with it, the ground would eventually show her what it was. That was not a sure thing. I want to be honest about my reasons because they were not entirely rational at the time. They were rooted in something my father had said to me once when I was 11 or 12 years old, standing on the edge of that same 40 acres when it still belonged to the Henschel family and was already causing them grief. He had looked out over the standing water and the matted grass and said to me, "There is more to that field than anyone's bothered to check on." I had not thought about that remark in decades. It surfaced in my mind the August before the auction when my daughter mentioned she had seen the 40 listed in the county surplus inventory, and something in my memory shifted, the way a piece of equipment will suddenly unstick after years in a shed. And I thought, he meant something specific. He always meant something specific. I did not go looking for the notebook right away. I want to own that, because it is an important part of this story, and I am not proud of the delay. My father died in the spring of 2008, and he left behind a machine shed full of tools and a wooden crate under the workbench that I had moved twice without opening. The crate was old pine, dovetailed corners, and it had his initials burned into one end with what looked like a wood-burning tool, and inside it were three things: a Stanley hand level with a cracked vial, a draw knife that had been sharpened so many times the blade was thin as a butter knife, and a marbled composition notebook with a piece of twine tied around it. I had seen the notebook before. I had picked it up when I first went through the shed after the funeral, read the first 2 pages, and put it back, because the first 2 pages were soil drainage notes, in a handwriting that was careful and cramped and very much my father's, and in the grief of that spring I was not ready to sit with his handwriting for very long. I put the crate back under the bench and I left it there for 11 years. My daughter knew it was there. I had mentioned it once, not as anything significant, just as a thing her grandfather had left. When she came to me the morning after the auction in 2019 with coffee and that particular look she has when she is trying not to push too hard, she asked me if I still had his drainage notebook. I said I supposed it was still in the crate. She said she would like to look at it sometime when I was ready. That was a Thursday. By Saturday I had the notebook on the kitchen table. 11 years is long enough to postpone a thing. The notebook was 87 pages in my father's hand, and most of it was what you'd expect from a man who had farmed the same township his entire life. Tile depths and outlet conditions and seasonal water tables, and the names of fields by the families who had owned them, going back to observations he had made as a young man in the 1950s. He had looked at nearly every low field in the county at one time or another, making notes the way some men keep a fishing log, not because anyone asked him to, but because the information seemed worth keeping. The Henschel 40 appeared on page 51. His note for it was 6 lines dated June of 1967, and it described the surface drainage pattern, the outlet tile he had located running along the north fence line, and the general character of the soil. 5 of those 6 lines were straightforward. The 6th line was set apart from the rest with a space above it, and it was underlined twice in pencil, and it had a question mark at the end that he had gone over hard enough to leave an impression on the page beneath. The line read, "Muck layer depth unknown, probe refused at 31 inches, check what is below the clay lens." That was all. Probe refused at 31 inches, check what is below the clay lens. He had circled the word below and drawn a small arrow pointing down. He had never written another word about that field in the remaining 36 pages of the notebook. Whatever he had meant to check on, he had either checked and not recorded, or more likely, he had never gone back. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time with that notebook open to page 51. I thought about my father standing at the edge of that same water in 1967, a man in his mid-30s with a tile probe and a composition notebook, pushing that probe down through the muck and feeling it stop at 31 inches against something that wouldn't give, and writing down his question, and then the planting season coming, and the question going unanswered, the way questions do on a working farm when there is always something more pressing than an answer that can wait. The field doesn't care who believes in it. That was another thing he said, and I had always taken it as a comment about stubbornness, but sitting there with his notebook, I began to think it was something more specific than that. That field had been sitting out there for 60 years, refusing to tell its story to anyone who hadn't earned the right to hear it. By the following March, my daughter had run a perimeter of temporary electric fence around the 40, and we had worked out an arrangement with a man I know who runs a Berkshire cross operation about 40 miles north of us. He was willing to lease her 34 bred sows for the rooting season, And his lease price was reasonable, because the sows would come back to him in better condition than they left, given what managed hog rooting does to a sow's muscle tone, and he knew it. The agreement was simple. She would manage water and feed supplementation. He would take the sows back at the end of August, and whatever the ground produced by way of rooting and disturbance was hers to deal with. I told her it would take more than one season. She said she understood that. What I did not tell her, because I was not yet sure enough to say it aloud, was what I was specifically hoping those sows would find when they worked down through the muck. My father's note had been sitting in my chest like a stone since October, and I had spent the winter with a topographic survey and an old county soil survey from 1958 and a hand-drawn map my father had made at some point in the late 1960s that showed the general outline of the 40 as he had understood it. The soil survey described the field as predominantly palms muck over a silty clay loam subsoil, which is not unusual for a drained glacial lakebed in this part of the country. What was unusual, or at least what I had come to believe was unusual, was the reference in the soil survey notes to what the surveyor called an anomalous, coarser textured lens observed at variable depth along the northeast quadrant. The surveyor had noted it and moved on because soil surveyors in 1958 were mapping agricultural suitability, and a coarser lens under a muck field was of academic interest only. But my father had pushed a probe into that northeast quadrant in 1967 and hit something at 31 inches and written down his question, and I had spent a winter putting those two things together and arriving at a possibility I was not ready to speak out loud quite yet. The neighbor to the east of the 40 is a man named no one I'll name here, but I will tell you that he farms clean ground and runs a clean operation and keeps his trucks washed. And he had watched the auction listing come and go the previous September with what I can only describe as cheerful certainty that the 40 was worthless. He pulled into my daughter's lane on a morning in early April, maybe a week after the sows went in, and rolled his window down and watched them for a while without saying anything. Then he said, "What are you doing with 34 fat hogs on 40 acres of standing water?" My daughter told him she was managing the hydrology through biological disturbance. She said it just like that, because she has a way of making plain things sound precise and vice versa. And she had been reading everything she could find about managed swine rooting for the previous 4 months. He looked at her for a moment. He said, "There isn't $3 an acre of farmable ground in that field." She said, "I know what I paid for the acre." He did not have a response to that. He rolled his window back up and drove out the way he came, and by noon the diner in town had a version of the story, and the version had grown, as it does, until she had apparently told him that she was going to turn the flooded 40 into a productive farm using nothing but hogs and patience, which is more or less accurate but sounds considerably more eccentric when it has been through 3 or 4 retellings over coffee. I did not go to the diner that week. I have learned at my age that certain fights are better conducted on the ground than in conversation, and the ground would take time. The sows worked that northeast quadrant in a way I had not seen ground worked before, and I want to try to describe it accurately because the behavior of those animals was not random and it was not equally distributed across the 40 acres. Hogs root to thermoregulate and to forage, which anyone who has kept pigs knows, but they also root in patterns that reflect what is underneath. And what those 34 sows did in the northeast corner of that field in the first 3 weeks of April told me something before I had a single soil probe in the ground. They moved to that quadrant and they stayed there. They did not work the field evenly the way you might expect if they were simply rooting for comfort or for the cattail rhizomes that were available throughout. They established a clear preference for a roughly 6-acre section of the northeast corner, and within that 6 acres they worked with a consistency and a depth of disturbance that was different from what they were doing elsewhere. By the 3rd week of April, that corner of the field was disturbed to a depth of 12 to 16 inches across most of its area, and the sows were still working it, still pushing deeper in places where the ground allowed. I walked that section every morning before the dew was off. I took a tile probe with me, and I pushed it into the disturbed ground in a grid pattern every 20 feet, writing down the depth at which I felt resistance and the character of what I was probing through. The muck was soft and wet in the upper layers, as you'd expect, but at depth it varied in a way that matched the pattern of the sow's preference almost exactly. Where they worked hardest and deepest, my probe found something different at around 28 to 33 inches. Not clay. Not the dense, silty refusal you get when you hit a clay layer. Something with more resistance than muck, but less than clay. Something with a slight graininess to the feel that you can detect through a 6-foot tile probe if you have been using one long enough to know what different materials feel like coming back up through your hands. My father had pushed his probe into that same quadrant in 1967 and stopped at 31 inches. I was stopping at 28 to 33. We were finding the same thing, separated by 52 years. I called a man I know who had spent 30 years doing soil investigations for drainage and construction projects in this part of the state before he retired, and who now does occasional private consulting because, as he puts it, he has not found anything more interesting to do with his time. I told him what I had and what I thought I was seeing, and there was a pause on the phone that I have learned to respect in that man, because his pauses are not empty. They are where he is doing the work. He said he would come out on a Thursday. He came out on a Thursday in early May, 2 weeks after I called him, and he brought his own probe and a set of thin-walled sampling tubes and a hand auger with extensions that could reach 6 feet below the surface. He did not say much when he arrived. He looked at the field, at the sows and their pattern, and he walked the northeast quadrant with me in a silence that was entirely comfortable, because this is a man who has spent his career letting the ground do the talking. He augered 7 holes in that 6-acre section, pulling cores and laying them out on a piece of canvas he had brought for the purpose. He took his time. The cores came up in layers, muck on top, black and fibrous, then a transitional zone that darkened and compacted, then the silty clay loam that the soil survey had described, and then, below the clay lens at depths ranging from 27 to 34 inches depending on the location, something else. A layer of coarser material, sandy in texture, well sorted, with a character that said water had moved through it and sorted it at some point in the geologic past. He laid out the 7th core and stood up and looked at it for a long time without saying anything. I did not rush him. He picked up a pinch of the coarser material from the bottom of the core between his fingers and rubbed it and looked at it in the morning light, which was thin and cool and coming low from the east across the field. Then he said one word. He said, "Substantial." That was all. We walked back to his truck, and he wrote some notes in a spiral pad he kept in his shirt pocket, and he said he would put together a written summary, and he said that, in his estimation, the deposit in that northeast quadrant was consistent with what he would describe as a significant accumulation of coarse outwash material, likely a buried channel, remnant from glacial drainage, at a depth and extent that would have been entirely invisible from the surface. He said the sows had found the edge of it in the first week and had been working along it since. He said he had never seen an animal locate a subsurface feature like that without assistance. I told him my father had found the edge of it with a tile probe in 1967 and written it down, and I showed him the notebook page. He read it and handed it back and said, "Your father was paying attention." Then he got in his truck and drove out, and I stood there in the field with the morning sun finally clearing the tree line to the east, and I held the notebook, and I thought about my father standing in that same spot 54 years before with his probe and his question that had gone unanswered. The field had been waiting. That is not a sentimental statement. It is an accurate one. The question after May was what the deposit meant in practical terms, and I want to walk through that carefully because the practical terms are where a lot of people would have made a mistake, and I have made enough of my own that I know what the temptation looks like. The temptation was to move fast, to bring in equipment, to core the whole 6 acres aggressively and get a definitive volume estimate and start thinking about what could be done with a significant sand and gravel deposit sitting under a drained muck field. I did not do that. My daughter did not do that. We had a conversation at her kitchen table in May, a long one, with the notebook open and the consulting man's written summary and a county soil map spread out alongside, and she asked me how many acres we were talking about in terms of the deposit's likely extent, and I told her honestly that we did not know yet, that we had good evidence for 6 acres and reasonable inference for perhaps a bit more, and that the depth and character of the deposit needed to be confirmed by additional sampling before any other decision made sense. She asked what additional sampling would cost. I told her. She said, "Do it right." That is a piece of her grandfather in her. Do it right. And do not spend what you haven't confirmed yet. I arranged for a geotechnical firm 2 counties over to run a systematic augering program across the northeast quadrant and an expanded area in late June, a total of 31 auger borings, on a pattern designed to define the extent and depth of the deposit, with enough confidence to support a volume estimate. That work took 4 days and cost more than she had paid for the 40, which I will acknowledge sounds like a punchline, but is a reasonable investment when the alternative is making a large decision on incomplete information. The results came back in a written report in mid-July. The deposit occupied an area of approximately 9.5 acres in the northeast corner of the 40. Its depth below the muck surface ranged from 24 inches at the shallowest point to 41 inches at the deepest. The material itself was described as well-sorted, fine to medium sand with gravel in the range of 15 to 20% by volume, consistent with a buried glaciofluvial channel deposit. The estimated recoverable volume, after accounting for the overlying soil layers and practical extraction geometry, was in the range of 80,000 to 110,000 cubic yards. I will let that number sit for a moment because I remember sitting with it myself in July of 2021 in my daughter's kitchen with the report open on the table, and the number took some sitting with. The county had sold her that 40 for $40. The consulting and boring program had cost her somewhat more than that. And sitting beneath 31 inches of muck and clay in the northeast corner of a field that a man 2 rows back at an auction had described as a cattail marsh was somewhere between 80,000 and 110,000 cubic yards of sand and gravel in a county where clean fill material was selling that summer in the range of $8 to $11 a yard delivered, and pit run sand was moving at $4 to $6 at the source. I did not tell the neighbor to the east anything for some time after that. There was no reason to, and I have never believed that vindication is improved by speed. The sows finished their season in late August and went back north to the man who owned them in better condition than they had arrived, as he had predicted. And the northeast quadrant of that field looked as though something ancient had been turned over, which is precisely what had happened. My daughter spent the fall working through the regulatory side of things because a sand and gravel extraction operation requires permits in this state, and the permitting process is not short, and it is not simple, and I will say only that she approached it with the same patience she had brought to everything else about that ground, and that by the following spring she had the preliminary approvals needed to begin conversations with operators. She did not rush that either. She talked to 3 different operators before she found one whose proposed terms and practices she was satisfied with, and the agreement she reached was structured so that the extraction would proceed in phases over multiple years, with reclamation concurrent with extraction, which is the way her grandfather would have insisted on doing it if he had ever gotten back to that field with his probe and his question. He did not get back to it. She did. The neighbor to the east drove by on a morning in September of 2022, when the first phase of extraction had been underway for about 6 weeks, and the nature of the operation was visible from the road. He pulled into her lane, which I have come to regard as his preferred method of forming an opinion, and he sat in his truck for a moment, looking at the equipment working in the northeast corner. Then he rolled his window down, and he said, "I didn't know there was anything under there." My daughter said my great-grandfather knew something was there. He thought about that. He said, "Well," he said, "that's not as wet as it was." Then he put his truck in reverse and backed out and drove south toward his own place, and that was the whole conversation. By noon, the diner had a version of that too, and I am told the version was considerably more charitable than the one from 2 years before, which is its own kind of progress. My father used to say the field doesn't care who believes in it. I have spent a long time deciding what exactly he meant by that, and I think now that he meant it as a statement of patience rather than stubbornness, though the two are related. The field held what it held for 10,000 years before anyone pushed a probe into it, and it held it through 60 years of county ownership and drainage assessments and plat map listings and polite certainty from men in clean trucks, and it would have held it for another 60 if my daughter had not bought it for $40 on a Wednesday evening in September and stood in the fog on a Tuesday in October holding the deed and deciding to be patient. The probe refused at 31 inches. That was my father's language, and it is the truest thing written in that notebook. The ground refused to give up what it had until someone earned the right to ask the question properly. And the way you earn that right, as near as I can tell, is to go slow and to listen and to bring in 34 good sows and let them do the kind of reading that no soil survey from 1958 and no extension service clipboard and no county drainage committee had thought to attempt. I have turned the notebook over to my daughter, which felt right. It belongs with the ground now, or as close to the ground as a notebook can get. She keeps it in the machine shed, in the wooden crate, with the hand level and the draw knife, and I think her grandfather would find that reasonable. The difference between a problem and a lesson is only whether you were paying attention. He paid attention in 1967 and wrote down his question, and she paid attention in 2019 and bought his question for $40, and the ground gave them both the answer in its own time. If you have got ground that people have given up on, or an old tool that no one thinks is worth the rust, or a notebook in a crate that you have been meaning to open for longer than you want to admit, I would be glad to hear about it in the comments. And if this kind of story means something to you, subscribe because we move slow on this channel, but I believe we get there.